So we're talking about an agenda for corporate governance that promote diversity and inclusion from a multi-stakeholder approach. That was said today at a colloquium organized by the Nigerian Exchange, the section on business law of the Nigerian Bar Association, and the Institute of Directors. Now, one of the panel discussions was focused on how to advance diversity and inclusion in leadership roles in the business environment. Let's take excerpts from the panelists' contributions.
But it requires a mindset from the top that basically accepts this and creates programs as well as initiatives to make sure that you're actually hiring right. It also requires the right brand strategy. If your brand on your website, for example, you have pictures of only men, why would I apply? I just wouldn't, right? So from a brand strategy perspective, we really need to start understanding that brand strategy plays a really big role in communication, in how we shape our culture. It plays a role in the type of talent that we can attract. It plays a role in how we're perceived by stakeholders and our consumers, whether those are investors, whether those are actual customers, right? Or whether those are potential employees. So we need to build brands that actually signal that we're focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. If we don't do that, then we will not attract the right type of talent. I think also we need to just cast our net wider. A lot of the time we'll just simply say, oh, well, we didn't find anyone, right? We didn't find anyone who is under 40, who is a woman and who is in technology. Well, here I am, now over 40, but, those should be criteria, right? Because especially when we think about our consumer base and just stakeholders at large being cross-generational, right? You're not just catering to one generation, you're catering to multiple generations. If you don't have representation of millennials, of Gen Z within your leadership team, you're going to go down the wrong path at some point, right? And I think that's where future-proofing your business and sustainability really comes in. But at the root cause of it is really the mindset shift that needs to happen, and people just having to be very, very intentional and really also understanding what the benefits are. And I think globally there's a lot of data, but I think locally there are not enough statistics out there. There's not enough data even within the organizations, right? So I think M&E also plays a really big role to make sure that we're tracking the right type of stats within the organization, that we're actually aware of it. Because the truth is that we will only see what we're used to.
I think there's an aspect that we need to talk about in terms of diversity. And I'm happy that Mrs. Etumudon is in the room. Now, I'm going to talk because, like we said, we talk about gender, even age, even ethnicity. But the truth of the matter is that when it comes to the statistics around people with disability or living with disability, in fact, we have not even started. And so we have a lot of work to do, and I'm not sure that just strategy formulation alone is going to achieve what we need to do in that area. Now, an alarming statistic which we got from the Trade Union Congress of Nigeria, Women Commission, and the Solidarity Center, they carried out a survey, and the survey was of more than 500 workers with disabilities in Nigeria's formal and informal sector. Now, what they found is that most workers with disabilities cannot access decent work as defined by the UN International Labour Organization. The survey found that regardless of legislation aimed at addressing diversity in the Nigerian workplace, disabled workers do not experience the same access to employment opportunities. Now, we are talking about trying to advance diversity and inclusion in leadership. But where we don't even have people with disabilities that have been recruited through the system, then we really have a lot of challenge in our hands. So I would like to ask Mrs. Etumodo that what can we do, whether from the government, by the public sector, by the private sector, what can we do to address this alarming circumstance that we have?
One other way that we can stem the problem of unemployment for persons with disabilities is to give tax rebates. I think if government should start giving some form of rebate to companies who employ persons with disabilities, others who want to join in, others who want to key in and see how they can take advantage of that. And that, in essence, will be providing, like the Chinese proverb says, if you feed a man, you have fed him for a day. But if you teach him how to fish, you have fed his family or his generation. And I extend it to say, if you teach him how to fish, you've not just fed his first line, you fed an entire village. Because like in our society now, like Nigeria, we have this thing about you working. You're not just working for your immediate family. You have extended family and other persons who rely on you. And so it is the same thing too with when you employ someone with disability. You remove somebody from that poverty line. You have also been able to empower his family and every other person around him.
Can we begin to look at amendments in our codes of corporate governance and things like that that address the issue of people living with disabilities? We've heard that from the public sector, there's an act that now it requires 5%. What version of that can we bring into the private sector, and we look to the FLCN for that, FSRCC for that? Thank you.
Hello everyone, and I'm really humbled to be here. So I'm just taking a cue from what she said, and that's why this discussion that we're having here is actually very important, because it's only when we start engaging and having these discussions that would work and contribute towards having an equitable environment and society. So now talking about the FRC, Financial Reporting Council, I mean, that's the regulatory body that is responsible for setting accounting and corporate governance standards in Nigeria. Yeah, now if you look under the NCCG code is Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance, so 2018. That's certain principles there that actually promote for corporate governance and diversity inclusion. So you look at under principle, I think 2.2, it talks about the composition of the board, diversity in the composition of the board. And that it also extends that to encourage that there should be board committees that would also oversee diversity and inclusion matters. And then you also have, I think it's 3.2, that also talks about disclosure. So it's now encouraging entities, organizations to disclose their diversity policies in their annual returns. Yeah, so that also notwithstanding, on the issue of what she just talked about, I mean, it just drew my mind now looking at the Code of Corporate Governance, the way actually, in as much as it's very broad as well, in talking about diversity. So I think also bringing that into the play, it actually covers that. But in terms of specifically stating that, I think it's something that's why this conversation is actually very good. And I know we're also coming up with the Code of Corporate Governance for the not-for-profit and the public sector. But it's something worth going back and actually looking at, though this will take a while. But like she said as well, and that's the truth, we have a lot of laws and enactments that actually cover these things. But the problem with those, or rather the challenge, is the implementation, because our constitution is also very clear. I mean, there's the section that talks about that guarantees fundamental human rights. So there's the right to equitability and all that. So it's actually there in the Constitution. It's just the implementation that is our problem.
Once we focus more on the data and we also assess the team leads by how many women they have on their team, or how many ethnic groups they have on their team, how many people with disabilities they have on their team, right? Ms. Holliday was saying, people hire from the same schools and things like that. So there's bias everywhere. And I think once you measure and people are being, appraised against those measures and those metrics, then you would start seeing some level of change, right? The same way that if CBN says you have to have, 30% women on your board, suddenly there are women that can be on the board, right? Before it was like, okay, well, we don't need that. So I think one is data and just making sure that you're actually measuring. I think the other one is a lot of training for leadership, that is the current leadership, right? To really understand the benefits of what does it benefit me to have a more diverse team? What does it do for the bottom line of the organization? And really just also having programs and internal comms that amplifies that over and over again, right? I think another thing is to make sure that there is some level of mentoring and coaching, and that there are female role models that are at the top that take the time to speak to women who are in that 50% and who are about to drop off because they're going to get married, because they are going to have a family, right? And because they feel like the pressure of the work environment is too much simply because it's not flexible enough, there's not enough maternity leave. How many women don't come back from maternity leave because 3 months is simply not enough, right? Right? And that's just a fact. That's where you will see the major drop-off, right? You also see a drop-off when you start having organizations where the culture requires you to be there past your working hours, right? You see drop-offs where there's no virtual working, right? So we really need to think about how do we create an enabling environment, right? An environment that allows the mom to be at home when her kids come back from school. Those things are what also make society thrive, right?